It's a celebration of America's freedom. Welcome to the Marc Scaringi Show. The Marc Scaringi Show is your place for a weekly discussion on making America great again. The important political and legal issues of the day, a celebration of the Constitution, and traditional American values. Marc is a practicing attorney, a former senatorial candidate, a Donald J. Trump-endorsed delegate, and a defender of the Constitution. His goal? To put America first. And now, celebrating America's freedoms, here's attorney Marc Scaringi.
Well, good afternoon and welcome to the Marc Scaringi Show. This is your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. And this is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. And thanks for tuning in on WHP 580 and iHeartRadio. And also, thanks for tuning in on our various Facebook Live pages, Harrisburg 100 Facebook Live and some others. You're welcome to comment live, and we'll try to read your comments on the air. You're also welcome to call in at 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. If you'd like to watch some prior podcasts of the show or read any of my columns on Penn Live or take a look at some great merchandise we have, including our very popular Right to Bear Arms muscle shirt and the We're Glad You're Our Neighbor, Just Please Don't Kill Us yard signs, go to the marcscaringishow.com website. And for more political and legal news throughout the course of the week, don't forget to follow me on Twitter, Facebook, and YouTube. Well, we're very pleased today to have a special guest in the studio. We have Mr. Charlie Gerow of Quantum Communications. Charlie Gerow is Quantum's CEO. He's a nationally recognized leader in strategic communications and a trusted advisor to leaders in government and business. Named to the prestigious Influencers 500 list by Campaigns and Elections magazine, Charlie has been selected as one of the 50 most influential Pennsylvania Republicans by Politics magazine and one of the top 10 political consultants in Pennsylvania. He's also been called Harrisburg's most politically well-connected conservative by Harrisburg Magazine. Now, Charlie has appeared on virtually every television network and has been quoted in every major newspaper in the country. He serves as the political analyst and commentator for the weekly news show Face the State on CBS 21. You may have seen him there. He's been doing that for more than a decade, and he also appears Tuesdays and Thursdays on CBS 21, the evening news program, providing political commentary. And he writes a weekly column for the Harrisburg Patriot News and Penn Live, and monthly commentary for the region's Business and Capital Watch. And Charlie owns and manages the Harrisburg-based firm Quantum Communications, which is the premier communications, public relations, consulting, and media firm in Pennsylvania. Welcome, Charlie Gerow.
Wow, just like my mom wrote it, Mark. That's pretty good.
That's exhausting.
And most important, a return guest to the Marc Scaringi Show, but without the muscle shirt. I got to get me one of those.
The show will provide you with one of those as in your gift bag that you'll be leaving here today with. But we're very happy to have Charlie Gerow here in the studio. That's because our Democratic presidential primary friends are in the middle of a hotly contested primary election race. The nominee will go on to challenge Donald J. Trump in the fall. We started in the Iowa caucuses and then moved to New Hampshire. And we have Charlie Gerow here, a political analyst extraordinaire, to give commentary on what happened in Iowa and New Hampshire, and then what Democratic voters and those of us on the Republican side who are avid followers and watchers of what's happening on the other side of the aisle in their presidential primary election. And we're going to get commentary from Mr. Gerow, and he's going to set us straight, and he's going to show us the way forward for our Democratic friends. Now, the Iowa caucus fiasco, as it's being called, February 3rd, 2020. As of today, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, the former mayor of South Bend, Indiana, is leading Senator Bernie Sanders of Vermont by 1/10 of a percentage point in the Iowa caucuses from February 3rd. But is Buttigieg the winner? And that's the big question. We all know that the computer application that the caucus used to receive and tabulate and report the vote failed on caucus night. And since then, organizers have been scrambling to tally the vote by various other means, from handwriting them and calling them in on the telephone, where they were on hold for up to 90 minutes. Some officials took photos on their smartphones and then drove their smartphone to Democratic headquarters to report that way, only to be turned away. There much confusion, much chaos resulted from the Iowa caucuses, and the New York Times did an in-depth investigation into the tabulation and reporting of the vote. It reported that since the caucuses, the Iowa State Democratic Party has revised the results for about 100 of the state's 1,700 precincts, and officials are still scrambling to verify dozens more precinct results after reports of these widespread inconsistencies. And the Times redid all the math used in the vote counting and found many errors. In some cases, candidates were awarded delegates when they shouldn't have been. In other cases, precincts awarded more delegates than they were supposed to. In a handful of other cases, precincts awarded fewer delegates than they were supposed to. The Times checked the delegate math in more than 1,200 precincts. At least 28 appear to have gotten the math wrong, with consequences for the candidates. And as we say back in the old country, it was a real malafaguda. I don't know if you know that term, Charlie.
I do, actually.
The chairman of the Iowa Democratic Party, he has resigned, I believe, and there are calls for the chairman of the Democratic National Committee, Mr. Perez, to do the same. But here's what I want to know from you, Charlie. And I'm not going to ask you to redo all of the math or to come up with a better counting or reporting system. We know the problems the Iowa and the National Democratic Party have as a result of the caucus night fiasco. But what about the effects on the candidates? We've been talking a lot about the fiasco of the vote counting and reporting, but let's talk about the candidates. Now, the final delegate count, Buttigieg, 13 delegates, Sanders, 12 delegates, Warren, 8. The big story, Biden comes in 5th in the delegate count. The Associated Press has yet to call the race. The fact that it was so confusing on election night, we had no declared winner. What does that mean to Mayor Pete Buttigieg? Charlie.
Well, first of all, what it means is that the party, Mark, that tells us they can run every aspect of our lives, from health care to the Green New Deal, can't even count a couple 100,000 votes. That ought to be a real eye-opener for everybody. But unfortunately, for all of the candidates, and Buttigieg in particular, and their supporters, the work that they had put into the Iowa caucuses, which, is a run-up of months, unlike our primaries here, was completely lost. There's supposed to be a boost, a momentum builder coming out of Iowa. None.
The Big Mo, as former President George H.W. Bush.
The Big Mo. And there's supposed to be a night of celebration for the winners. Didn't have that. And so I actually feel badly for the people, because you and I have done this. It's hard work, particularly in Iowa, where you start out in sweltering heat and hot winds across the prairie and end up in freezing cold temperatures in early January. They didn't get their moment. And so, it's a tough time. But the practicality of it, Mark, is that whomever emerges as the ultimate winner of Iowa, it doesn't really matter. I mean, last week they were saying it was Bernie Sanders. I guess there's, a few more votes that have trickled in now that say that it might be Buttigieg. But either way, doesn't really matter.
But I agree with you. You do have to feel sorry for Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Did so well, came really from nowhere, did all of that organization, finished very strongly in a crowded field of some real heavyweight contenders. The former two-term vice president of the United States, incumbent United States senators. Here's the mayor of a small town in Indiana, South Bend. Former mayor, and does so well, but doesn't get that wind at his back that others have gotten in years past. You can go all the way back to 1976. Jimmy Carter went from Jimmy Carter who to the next president, the next nominee for the Democratic Presidential Party in 76, but not to Mayor Pete.
No, and I mean, on the Republican side, George H.W. Bush beat Ronald Reagan in the 1980 Iowa caucuses and propelled himself into the vice presidency and ultimately the presidency as a result. So Iowa has had a disproportionate influence. I'm here to make one prediction, Mark. Iowa isn't going to lead the nation in 4 years. Simply, they're not going to let it happen.
Yeah. We're going to talk more about the Iowa caucuses, the New Hampshire primaries, and then the primaries coming up, the Democratic presidential nomination contest for which Democrat candidate will go on to challenge President Donald J. Trump in the fall. We're here with Charlie Gerow of Quantum Communications. Stay tuned. We'll be back after this brief commercial break.
Now, more of Marc Scaringi on News Radio WHP 580.
And welcome back to the Marc Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. This is where we talk about the important political and legal issues of the day from the perspective of putting America first. We have special guest Charlie Gerow in the studio today. Charlie of Quantum Communications, perhaps the premier political analyst and consultant in Pennsylvania. He appears weekly on CBS Face the State, a television news program, talking about the important political and legal issues of the day. And so we're going to kind of tap Charlie's brain here and get his analysis on the Democratic presidential primary to date. We've been talking about the fiasco of the Iowa caucuses, Charlie, and how the Democratic Party has a big black eye coming out of the February 3rd caucuses in the Midwest part of our country, and how the winner, I'm not so sure, well, the Associated Press hasn't declared the winner yet, but the candidate who got the most delegates, Mayor Pete Buttigieg, who really needed a big push. He's a mayor of a smaller town in the country, no prior political experience before that, and this would have given him some real wind at his back. Now, actually, he did very well in New Hampshire following, and we're going to get into that. But we Republicans are reporting on the Iowa fiasco with a little glee, a little glint in our eye. I must admit to that. But we Republicans, we faced our own somewhat of a fiasco back in 2012 when Pennsylvania's own Rick Santorum really was the winner of the Iowa caucus, but was not declared to be the winner on election night. Can you take us back to 2012 and the Republican experience?
Yeah, the snafus in Iowa are not limited to 2020 and the Democrats. As you correctly point out, Mark, in 2012, the Republicans had a pretty similar situation. It wasn't quite as messed up as the Democrats managed to do theirs this year, but it took weeks before Rick Santorum was ultimately declared the winner, I think by 34 votes statewide.
Very close.
If I remember correctly, but he was actually declared the winner, and the narrative coming out of Iowa that night was that he had finished second to Mitt Romney.
That's right, and you know as well as I, the establishment of the Republican Party in 2012 was very much behind Mitt Romney. He was their favored candidate. They were pulling out all the stops to ensure that he would win the Iowa caucus. And then you have these upstarts, these grassroots conservatives, ultimately led by Rick Santorum. The polls going into Iowa in 2012 have been all over the place. And one can only wonder what would have happened to the candidacy of Pennsylvania's own Rick Santorum had he been declared the winner on election night and gotten all of that media attention and all of that focus on him, the fact that he won, that he can win, he can beat the governor. And do you think that would have changed ultimately the direction of Santorum's campaign?
Ultimately, probably not, but you're correct, Mark. What comes out of Iowa is a tremendous surge of energy, media attention, and with that, fundraising ability, and that's what propels campaigns forward. So, we could speculate a lot, but it certainly would have helped Santorum in 2012 had the news that ultimately came out been there on election night.
Yeah, that's a good point I forgot to mention. Those big dollar donors, they want to bet on a winning horse.
Absolutely.
And if your horse comes in first place out of Iowa, you've got some money now at your back, and that just it didn't happen in the Santorum case. But we'll try to stay current on the current news and the current issue. The old moniker, Charlie, only 3 tickets out of Iowa. Do you think that rings true this time around for the Democrats?
No, but I will say this, Mark. Historically, no candidate has ever finished 4th or 5th in both Iowa and New Hampshire and gone on to win their party's nomination. That's where Joe Biden is stuck right now, in 4th and 5th. So I don't know that he gets a ticket going forward for very far. He has enough money and organization and poll support to propel him at least through Nevada and South Carolina, but how much further than that he goes remains to be seen. But there were, by all estimates, going to be more tickets out of Iowa this year than previously before, and you've got a guy waiting on the side of the tracks down the road who didn't even participate in Iowa or New Hampshire. That's Mike Bloomberg, and certainly he, with his own fortune, has enough to jump on the train.
And I want to talk more about transitioning from Iowa to New Hampshire. You were on the Marc Scaringi show, I believe, last summer, I think you were. several months ago, and then we were talking about Kamala Harris and Elizabeth Warren, who was rising, who was declining. We were impressed with the quick rise of Kamala Harris, and then there was an equally quick fall. But Warren was, if I recall, I think you believe Warren was a strong contender, and she came in third in Iowa. Do you think Warren will have the legs and the strength now that she didn't do as well in New Hampshire in the upcoming primaries?
No. And if you look back, Mark, to that conversation we had, you were correct. I had said at that time that I didn't think Biden was going to be the Democratic nominee. In fact, when he announced his candidacy, I said this is his high watermark. Every poll showing him with an insurmountable lead, because those early polls are really based upon name identification and awareness, not upon true candidate support. And his support was a mile wide and an inch deep. But you were correct. I don't know where you were on. I think we were on the same page in thinking that Kamala Harris would be a much
She was very
stronger.
impressive
And she
back in
was,
that.
and
back
she
in the-
was, and she collapsed like a bad souffle. I mean, she, left the race early. But Elizabeth Warren simply hasn't been able to cut into that far left lane that Bernie Sanders occupies. I mean, she is in every respect his ideological counterpart or running mate, but she hasn't been able to cut into his base of support in the far, far left of the Democrat Party. I think her candidacy is history at this point.
Well, with Kamala Harris, and here we are going back in time, I think her inauthenticity ultimately did her in. Elizabeth Warren appears to be more sincere and more serious, more of a movement type candidate who's in it for the right reasons, for the issues that she wants to promote. But she has kind of a difficult past herself with the various statements about being a Native American and checking the box on the various job applications that she's a Native American.
You're very
et cetera.
kind, Mark. The out and out lies is more accurate, but
And
you're a diplomat today.
Do you think that has harmed her as much as the fact that she has not been able to take away anything from Bernie Sanders in that left lane?
Yeah, I think that has hurt her.
Because they love Bernie for his authenticity.
Well, everybody does. I mean, the one thing about Bernie is what you see is what you get.
Right.
What he says is what he believes. He's actually come right out and said in the past that he doesn't mind people calling him a communist. So you kind of know where the ball lies. With Warren, you're never quite sure because she does have this history of, shall we say, politely shading the truth.
Right.
So I don't think she ever caught into the authenticity factor that Bernie has. She clearly never got the intensity of support. I mean, Bernie's support base is passionate. It is, as you said, a movement. It's an anti-establishment movement, much like Trump had on the Republican side 4 years ago, and that can't be overlooked. I mean, I don't think Bernie is a, ultimate president of the United States, but he certainly is going to, if the Democrats keep the race fair, be in this thing right up until their convention in Milwaukee.
Yeah, and I'd have to agree with you. I don't know where Elizabeth Warren goes from here, in that in New Hampshire, she's the sitting incumbent United States Senator of the neighboring state and doesn't finish in the top three. I don't know where she goes in South Carolina. I can't see her doing well down there at all. Maybe Nevada will be her last attempt to stay in this race. But I want to talk more about New Hampshire. So we're out of Iowa. Mayor Pete Buttigieg, Bernie Sanders, kind of the co-winners of the Iowa caucuses. Then we move into New Hampshire, and the winners turn out to be Sanders, Buttigieg, and then Amy Klobuchar kind of comes out of nowhere. Elizabeth Warren down in fourth, and then Joe Biden basically destroyed at fifth place. But Amy Klobuchar, how does she come in third?
She ran, Mark, one great debate performance into one really good election night performance. And the thing that distinguished Amy Klobuchar, who, let's be candid, is a liberal senator from Minnesota. Centrist. I mean, this is centrist only by comparison. But the one defining moment for Amy Klobuchar was when they were asked on that debate stage, are you uncomfortable with a socialist at the top of your ticket? Only one, Mark, only one hand went up, and it was Amy Klobuchar. So anybody in New Hampshire who had a centrist or moderate view, was immediately attracted to Amy Klobuchar. And in Vermont, independents and non-aligned voters by registration are allowed to participate in the primaries, unlike here in Pennsylvania. And an awful lot of those independents voted in the Democratic primary, and an awful lot of them voted for Amy Klobuchar.
Yeah, and Klobuchar did very well. She took fifth place in Iowa, then surged in New Hampshire, placing third, got nearly 20% of the vote. Now her leap into the top three should help her campaign. Well, it has helped her campaign generate a lot of attention and perhaps the traction she needs going into Nevada and then South Carolina. But I wanted to ask you, our friends in the mainstream media, who are overwhelmingly Democrat and liberals, are talking about Bernie Sanders didn't do well in New Hampshire. They're comparing his New Hampshire results today from those 4 years ago when he got 60-some% of the vote, running only against one other candidate.
Right. Well, that's the problem, Mark. I mean, they compare apples and oranges. No, Bernie did not do as well as he did 4 years ago when it was head-to-head. A big field is necessarily going to mean you're going to get less votes. He went from 60% to 25%, though, and I do think that's a little bit of a warning sign to both Bernie's campaign and to the Democrats largely because, look, President Trump said it clearly in the State of the Union message last year. America will never be a socialist country. And Bernie Sanders, by his own reckoning, I mean, you can't call him a socialist. He calls himself a socialist. So that's ultimately not a winning position in a national election.
We're going to hear more from Charlie Gerow as he breaks down the Democratic presidential nomination contest for the 2020 presidential elections. After we return from this brief commercial break, you're listening to The Marc Scaringi Show. And welcome back to The Marc Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. We're talking about the 2020 Democratic presidential primary nomination contest with our in-house, well, he's not in-house, he's in-house today, in studio, political analyst, commentator Charlie Gerow of Quantum Communications. You see him weekly on CBS's Face the State, where he is interrogating the top politicians of Pennsylvania and beyond, really drilling down on them and making life uncomfortable, at least for the few moments they're on his show. But he's getting the answers to the questions the people of Pennsylvania need to hear.
Sometimes you got to dig a little deeper, Mark. The shall we say the BS factor we try to scrape away.
All right, we've talked about Amy Klobuchar. We've talked about Mayor Pete Buttigieg. We've talked about Bernie Sanders. Now we have Uncle Joe Biden. And the question is, whither Joe? Joe Biden's fourth and fifth place finishes in Iowa and New Hampshire have, according to many commentators, and we want to hear from Mr. Gerow, doomed his candidacy. He claims he has this firewall in South Carolina. He claims black voters who dominate Democratic Party politics in South Carolina will give him the decisive victory he needs to get back on top to sail into Super Tuesday when we have 15 states simultaneously voting on March 3rd. That's probably when the nomination will be decided. Probably, we'll see. But a recent poll does have Biden with, well, the polls are a little bit all over the place, but one poll has him with a 12-point lead over his Democratic rivals in South Carolina. But the Real Clear Politics average I just looked at this morning has Biden up with only a 6-point lead over Sanders and Tom Steyer in third place. Who is Tom Steyer?
Oh, my Lord.
How is he in third place? And I want to get your thoughts on that. But it seems like Biden and Elizabeth Warren have been trending downward precipitously in South Carolina. A February Quinnipiac poll showed Biden's support among African Americans at 27%, a 22-point drop from before the Iowa caucus. So, Charlie Gerow, whither Joe Biden?
Well, it goes back to my original thesis, Mark, which was that Joe Biden was not going to be the nominee of the Democratic Party in 2020, although in some respects he's probably their strongest candidate against Donald Trump, at least on paper.
On paper,
But
yeah.
Joe Biden has always been a terrible candidate. Go back through the history of his running for president. Never did very well. And his support, as I suggested, was largely due to the fact that he was well known.
Right.
Not much more than that. Now you've got a situation where he's been on the track through two primaries, a caucus and a primary, has done exceptionally badly. Exited New Hampshire before the votes were even all cast. Said during the debate he wasn't going to do well there. I mean, talk about energizing your
What a
base.
downer.
I mean, just a real downer. And now he's set this expectation bar back up very high, both in Nevada and especially in South Carolina. He's banking on the fact that you've got large minority populations in both states, about 20% Hispanic or Latino in Nevada, and roughly 30% African American in South Carolina. But again, his support there, Mark, was based largely upon the fact that they knew him. They liked him. He had been part of the Obama administration. He'd been around forever. But now you see it precipitously dropping. And as people begin to really look at what the realistic prospects are for 2020, I think it's going to continue to evaporate. I don't think Joe Biden gets into Super Tuesday unless he's really badly damaged and can just limp in.
Well, I want to ask you this, and you kind of hinted at it, and that is for a long time, Joe Biden has, whenever you ask him, he'll talk about South Carolina and how that's his wall and how he's going to win South Carolina. And then that became even something he uttered even more often after he lost Iowa and New Hampshire terribly. He ran to South Carolina on election night in New Hampshire, leaving his supporters there in an empty room with no Joe Biden. So Joe Biden has raised the bar so high on this purported win that we're supposed to expect from him in South Carolina. Charlie, what happens if he doesn't win South Carolina?
Well, if he doesn't win South Carolina, I don't think he even gets into Super Tuesday. But if he doesn't win South Carolina by a very significant margin, I think he's damaged himself. I mean, he has set that bar mark very, very high. Not only that he's going to win, but that this is his defining moment. It's a firewall, et cetera. Well, if you get, a 4, 5, 6 point win in South Carolina, people are going to say, okay, that was expected, but we expected him to do much better. It's almost going to be analogous to what folks are saying about Bernie Sanders in New Hampshire. I think Biden has a very difficult path ahead of him.
Well, Barack Obama did very well in Iowa. He won Iowa, if I'm not mistaken, in 2008, beating Hillary Clinton. And the political commentators, those who are in favor of Joe Biden, well, they say, well, Iowa's 90% white, New Hampshire's 90% white. That's why Joe Biden didn't do as well. What?
Yeah,
you can't win white voters? You're Joe Biden? You can't win white voters? Well, Barack Obama did.
Exactly. The Biden campaign has had some very interesting reads on the electorate in 2020, but the one that they haven't focused on is the fact that Joe simply doesn't have it. I mean, it's just the energy's not there. What's the president call him? Sleepy Joe. He doesn't have a defining message. He comes out with this goofy attack on this woman in New Hampshire.
Poor lady. I felt sorry for her.
It was just bizarre.
Wait a second. What was that? You are nothing but a lying
dog-faced pony soldier or something.
Dog-faced pony soldier. That's it.
I mean,
what is that?
I have no idea.
Oh, by the way, I got to put out our telephone number. Call in. You can talk to Charlie Gerow. You can ask him any question you have about politics here. In particular, we're talking about the Democratic primary, 717-540-0580. That's 717-540-0580. And you're welcome to comment live. I forgot about that. I've been dominating the conversation here with Mr. Gerow, but my listeners are welcome to call in. We've got lots of people watching on Facebook Live, so you're welcome to comment. Call in again, 717-540-0580. And Joe Biden is what is it with Joe Biden and the black vote in South Carolina? What I don't understand is why Joe Biden would presume that black voters are going to be with him in South Carolina and across the country. I don't know that Joe has ever made any special connection or what is it in Joe Biden's past political accomplishments that would endear him into the hearts and minds of black voters. We a few months ago, we learned about Joe Biden lauding and congratulating his former segregationist senatorial colleagues in the United States Senate. We've listened to his ridiculous stories about how he was a lifeguard in the black area of Wilmington, talking about his fights with who was the thug he called from Candy Pop or Soda Pop or something like that. Where is this? where does Joe Biden, is it in his mind only where he has this, the black voters of America are in love with him?
Well, I think it was twofold coming into the campaign. One was that the political folks in South Carolina, in particular, in the African-American community, knew him. They had dealt with him. They had been friendly with him, and he believed that their support translated deep, deep, deep into the ranks of ordinary voters. And B, I think he was banking on his relationship and the fact that he served as vice president to Barack Obama. And third, Mark, I think that as the campaign progressed, he was banking on the fact that Pete Buttigieg has a serious problem with African Americans. The black community does not like Pete Buttigieg, and that Bernie Sanders and Elizabeth Warren would ultimately have no appeal because of their socialist propensities with ordinary voters, particularly African American voters in South Carolina.
Remember, according to President Trump, it's Mayor Pete Buttigieg. Well, we're going to open the phone lines. We'll take some calls. We're here with Charlie Gerow, and you can ask him for his analysis, his thoughts on the 2020 Democratic presidential primary contest. We have Roosevelt from Steelton. You're on the Marc Scaringi Show.
Hey, guys. How's it going?
Very well, Roosevelt.
Look, the way I look at it, first of all, one of the things I like Bloomberg's approach, because really, I don't pay attention to Iowa and New Hampshire, okay? They are white states, okay? And as an African-American, I can't wait till they get into some of the African-American states, okay? I don't normally pay attention to that. And that ain't good for black folks anyway, okay? Because what ends up happening is you got people who start campaigning a year before or the first primary, and then they run out of money by the time it gets there. I think they should skip those two to begin with from start.
Hey,
They're useless.
Hey, Roosevelt, I've got 1 minute here, but let me ask you, as an African American here in Harrisburg, what do you think about Joe Biden? And has Joe Biden ever done anything to reach out to you? Has Joe Biden in his political career ever done anything that makes you stand up and say, "Hey, I'm for Joe Biden"?
I like Joe Biden. Now, I'm not an Elizabeth Warren person personally, but I do like Joe Biden. I like him better than I do Bernie Sanders, quite frankly. Okay, so and the downright bottom line is anybody is better than Trump.
Let me ask you this, and I've got only 30 seconds. You got to be real quick, Roosevelt from Steelton. What about Mayor Pete Buttigieg?
No.
Okay. All right. Well, we've heard it from Roosevelt from Steelton. Thanks for calling in. Roosevelt says a big N-O for Mayor Pete Buttigieg. And we're going to take a brief commercial break. We're here with Charlie Gerow. So write the number down, 717-540-058. You can call in and talk to Mr. Gerow. We'll be back right after this brief commercial break.
580.
And welcome back to the Marc Scaringi Show, your place on the dial for constitutional conservatism. We're here with special guest Charlie Gerow of Quantum Communications. You see him weekly on CBS 21 News' Face the State, where he's grilling our elected leaders, national, state, and local leaders about the important political issues of the day. We have him here in studio. He's a political analyst, consultant, and he's breaking down the 2020 Democratic presidential primary contest for us. And we've discussed Iowa, we've discussed New Hampshire, we've started to get into South Carolina and the demise of Joe Biden. We had a call from Roosevelt of Steelton, and he's an African-American, self-identified African-American from Steelton. Roosevelt's a big N-O on Mayor Pete Buttigieg. But I want to ask Charlie about Roosevelt had mentioned Mike Bloomberg. And now we have with Joe Biden, kind of the leader of the moderate wing of the Democratic Party, flailing and probably will be knocked out after he loses South Carolina. Now we have Mayor Mike Bloomberg, who has spent $300 million of his own money in ads. I heard one on the radio on WHP 580, by the way, on the way up here to the studio today. He's worth about $60 billion, has said that he will spend up to $1 billion. He is a multi-billionaire, has many more billions than our president, although don't tell the president I said that. He does not like to admit that. But this guy's got some serious cash, Mike Bloomberg. and he is now going to be getting into the race, I think, at Super Tuesday. Is that when he's going to be getting in the race? So, Charlie Gerow, what about Mike Bloomberg, his impact on the race?
His strategy has been tried before and was a failed strategy, waiting till later primaries, but it looks like it may
Rudy
be.
Giuliani.
That's who I'm referring to, but it looks like he's made a very wise decision in 2020. And with the hundreds of millions of dollars that he's already spent, Mark, and is going to continue to spend, he doesn't have to worry. He's going to be rising in the polls because his awareness level is going to go up and up and up and up. The fact that he's running ads here in Pennsylvania, which doesn't hold its primary until April, is significant. The problem for Mike Bloomberg is that although these ads are terrific, I mean, they're slick, they're high production values, et cetera, people don't make their decisions based upon 30-second television ads. They want to see the candidates up close and personal. They want to observe them on the debate stage. They want to see them out on the hustings. And for Mike Bloomberg, to be very candid, that's a problem because he's just not a very likable guy. And frankly, he doesn't like people very much. So this is a tough business for him to be in. And some of his old comments, i.e. putting minority kids up against the wall, are already coming back to haunt him.
I want to ask you more about that, but you hit on something. He's a multi-billionaire. Our president's a billionaire. And there was thought that President Trump, when he was then candidate Trump, being a billionaire living in a gold-plated Trump Tower, would not have the common touch, would not have the ability to connect to the average person in America. And I think that's all been wrong. I think it's just very plain to me that he has a great ability to reach out and connect to the average Joe Sixpack, so to speak. Bloomberg, not so much.
No, you're exactly right, Mark. I mean, the difference personality-wise between those two men is a mile wide. Donald Trump, ultimately a kid from Queens, Michael Bloomberg, a child of privilege, and just a very different way of approaching people. Trump talks the ordinary guy's language. Bloomberg does not.
Trump speaks like the rest of us, and it's easy to identify with him and what he's saying, even though he's a little bit richer than most of us. We'll open the phone lines here. We've got Richard from Ephrata. Richard, what is now I'm forgetting the line, the Joe Biden line.
Lying dog-faced pony soldier.
Very good, very good. Lying dog-faced pony soldier. Now, where does Uncle Joe get that line from?
I can't believe I've heard talk show guys all week saying, what does that mean? And no one's lying. Okay, what it is, it's an American Indian's attitude toward the cavalry when they were fighting.
Really?
Lying. Okay, remember Indians said white man speaks with forked tongue?
Yeah.
Dogface has always been a nickname for a soldier.
Right, yeah, I do remember that. World War II era.
For fancy pants, flyboys, and swabbies, right?
Yeah.
But the Army guys were dogface.
Right.
Okay, and pony soldier means cavalry.
Oh, that's it. So this is an old Native American saying. Why didn't Elizabeth Warren come up with this?
I was thinking about saying that.
You see the things we learn here on the Marc Scaringi Show, Charlie.
I am an open book.
Richard from Ephrata.
Now, what's his name? The Vice President, Joe.
Joe Biden, Uncle Joe.
Biden. He might have spruced it up, but I think that's where it came from.
That's it. You got it. Richard from Ephrata, thanks for calling. We've learned so much here on the Marc Scaringi Show today. Biden taking a lot of heat in the media, mainstream media even, for that odd and silly and weird attack on that nice young girl who asked a very legitimate question. And I don't want to get back on Joe Biden because I think, Charlie, you identified his problems very, very well. Mike Bloomberg, and you had mentioned Mike Bloomberg is the perceived savior of the Democratic Party. You know as well as I, the establishment, the big money donors, the media, they're going to start to get behind Mike Bloomberg.
They are.
They think that he is the only one who can pull this fiasco out of the fire and have a legitimate shot at Donald Trump now that we've seen Joe Biden flail out, and they don't want Bernie Sanders. Even MSNBC is saying derogatory, critical things about Bernie Sanders. They're not feeling the burn because they know how inflammatory he really is. Chris Matthews talking about he doesn't want Bernie Sanders because he knows what socialism is. And he doesn't.
And James Carville says, "At least I'm not a communist."
At least I'm not a communist. Carville fighting back at Biden at Sanders. They had a nice little exchange there, but Chris Matthews talking about how he's afraid that if Sanders is elected, we're going to have beheadings in Central Park. That's real socialism. These are old school politicos, James Carville, Chris Matthews. They grew up in the Democratic Party during the Cold War.
Right.
And they know what socialism really is, and they fear it. They have a physical, palpable fear for it.
They do. And when Bernie Sanders was honeymooning in Moscow, they were fighting against Russian communism. The Democratic Party, Mark, has never been a socialist party. It's always been a capitalist party. Yes, they wanted a bigger social safety net and all those things. That was a fair fight and a fair discussion between Republicans and Democrats. But when you say we're going to abandon our capitalist underpinnings and go with a socialist model, it's something very, 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 very different.
Yeah, and that's where the Democratic Party is really struggling. And if you look at Bernie Sanders does not do well at all with the elderly in the Democratic Party.
Right.
Because they grew up during the Cold War.
JFK, Cold Warriors.
Very different political party on the Democratic side today. But Mike Bloomberg is he going to be the salvation of the Democratic Party? You mentioned he's got some problems. He's got some problems, at least according to the media, with African-American voters. I'm not so sure the polls reflect that. I think he does fairly well among African-American voters.
Thus far.
In the polls.
Yes, no, thus far, Mark. And again, it's going to be a matter of what Bloomberg likes after people get a real look at him. They haven't gotten that yet. They've gotten a very, very slick, well-packaged, well-managed presentation of Mike Bloomberg through Madison Avenue Advertising. But once he's out on the debate stage where he has to answer questions directly, once he's out on the hustings and gets confronted by voters like Joe Biden did the other day, how he responds is going to be very interesting.
I watched an interview on The View. I don't know if you've ever watched the ladies on The View.
I try not to.
I watch them because they're so much fun. It's political theater. Some of the absurd things they said, but they have the prosecutor, Sunny Holston. She had Amy Klobuchar on after Amy's the great job she did in New Hampshire, and Amy Klobuchar's feeling good. She's got some wind in her back, but she ran into a brick wall with Sunny's cross-examination of her on her record as a prosecutor, as a city or as a county attorney in Minnesota, with not prosecuting police officers who had shot and killed African Americans in the line of duty. And then she just tore into her on one particular case involving a 16-year-old black male who, I guess according to Sunny, was framed and wrongfully accused, tried, and prosecuted for a killing. But that was a vicious interview, and I felt sorry for Klobuchar. And Klobuchar did a bad job. Klobuchar just said we need an investigation. Klobuchar is calling for an investigation of herself as a prosecutor. Just did not do that well.
Many years later.
But think about Mike Bloomberg. Now, you mentioned this earlier. The stop and frisk program is not something that a lot of the black pundits on MSNBC favor. And Bloomberg has some language, some comments that are on audio. President Trump tweeted them out, of course, and others have tweeted them out, where he's talking about throwing black kids up against the wall and frisking them. That doesn't resonate too well, I would think, among African-American voters.
It doesn't. And the bizarre thing, Mark, is that the stop and frisk program, begun by Rudy Giuliani and properly administered by Mike Bloomberg, actually worked. It helped to bring crime way down.
Trump was an advocate of the stop and frisk program.
Trump was, and frankly, it worked. But it was not politically popular, particularly on the left side of the aisle. But now Bloomberg is apologizing for it on one hand, saying, oh, no, I probably shouldn't have gone. And then on the other hand, out are coming these comments that he made, which were way over the top, because nobody that supported the stop and frisk program was saying we ought to throw young black kids up against the wall.
Exactly.
Mike Bloomberg said that.
That's right. Very good point to point that out. Charlie, we only have about a minute left, so we're looking at Nevada first, and then we're looking at South Carolina, and then Super Tuesday on March 3rd. What are your thoughts? What is your analysis or predictions moving forward?
I don't want to make any predictions. I really don't. Nevada's going to be very interesting because of the labor dominance there. The big labor union there endorsed Sanders 4 years ago. They're not endorsing him this time around. What I want to spend the last 30 seconds on, though, Mark, is Donald Trump's performance in New Hampshire. Record high, the biggest vote for any incumbent running for re-election in the state's history. The enthusiasm is on Trump's side.
Yeah, and that's a harbinger of things to come. That's an excellent point that most in the mainstream media haven't covered. That Trump has got a juggernaut, and he's running hard, and he's going to win big in the fall. That's my prediction. That's about all the time we have today for the Marc Scaringi Show. Thanks for listening.